Hello, and welcome to Cyberproof Petabytes of NAS Data at Scale with Rubrik and AWS. Today's webinar is sponsored by Rubrik and AWS and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special panel discussion. Now, before we get into today's great content, and it's going to be a great discussion, I'm really looking forward to it, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of the session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in your webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. That Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. A browser refresh will fix most audio, video, or slide advancement issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know there in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Now next, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. I'd especially like to call your attention to three of them. There's a link to book a meeting and receive a $100 gift card. There's a Rubrik Zero Labs report on the state of data security, and there's a solution brief on protecting NAS file data with Rubrik for AWS. So I encourage you to access those resources now and share them with your friends and colleagues. Now, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. The official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section as well. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Now, finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. So to help encourage your questions during the Q&A portion, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. After the event is over, we'll look at all the questions that came in, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. So with all that out of the way, let's get to today's panel discussion. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters today. We have Natasha Loeffler-Little, who's Principal Product Manager at Rubrik and the moderator of the main discussion here today. We have Jason Cook, Field CTO for the Americas at Rubrik. And we have Tom Harwood, who is Principal Storage Specialist for Amazon Web Services. So welcome, everybody. Natasha, I'll turn things over to you to get us underway.
Great. Thanks, Scott. Welcome, Jason and Tom. I'm super excited to be here to have a fireside style chat with you two. And before we get into introductions, to fully set the mood here, because we're going to be sharing stories, we're really holding space, dedicating time to talking about unstructured data, cyberproofing it, all the things related to scale. I want to have this mood set. We're virtual, but we're imagining. Nice hotel style fire behind us. We're in cozy chairs. There's a cheese board in front of us. What type of cheese do we have on top of our board?
So I'm going to go sharp cheddar, definitely. I think a nice, like a salty Parmesan, you know, or maybe like a Romano for sure. And then, what's that Asiago? I like that one because it's kind of, you know, benign, you know, like it doesn't really have a strong flavor one way or the other. That's nice what I say.
That's a really nice mix. Yeah. Tom, how about you? What do you add to that board?
I'd put a little brie in there as well if we're going something neutral. I like brie.
Okay, awesome. And I'll add a goat cheese because I didn't hear a goat version there. So we'll have like, okay, perfect. So we've got this set. I'm super excited to be here because this is exactly what I get to do all day, not creating cheese boards, although I do entertain on the weekends occasionally and do that. But here at Rubrik, I get to sit with experts like Jason and Tom at the same table where we're looking at how do we talk about and then build solutions with our partners. And so I'm super excited to have you both here, like I said, to spend time on the topic of unstructured data and what our listeners should be thinking about. And, you know, the goal is that we inspire and that we also perhaps introduce some new thoughts for them to take away today. So Tom, I'd love for you to first introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your background and your experience as a practitioner.
So again, Tom Harwood, Amazon Web Services. This year marks 40 years that I've been in the IT space. So that's why I have all these gray hairs. I started out as a mainframe administrator back in 1983 and started working with network attached storage back in 1987 using NFS on SunOS, for those of you who remember that. In the mid-90s, I moved to a systems engineering role with a company called Auspex Systems, who actually came out with the first commercially available NFS hardware solution. Auspex was the company that NetApp spun out of. And then I eventually moved on to EMC, focusing on NAS and SAN solutions as a technical architect, and then to Veritas, where I worked on storage and high availability systems as a product manager for 16 years. And I have now been at Amazon for 2 years, working as a storage specialist, focusing on go-to-market with our data protection partners. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion today.
Perfect. Thanks, Tom. And Jason, same. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, I'd be delighted to. So Jason Cook, Field CTO for the Americas here at Rubrik. I've been with Rubrik almost 7 years. I started at Rubrik in the field. I am currently based in Nashville, Tennessee. So when I started with Rubrik, I work with the Southeast predominantly from a territory perspective. I've held a variety of leadership roles at Rubrik. That's mostly what my career has been at Rubrik, and this is the first time I've stepped back into an IC position in some time. So my principal responsibility is to be of customers and prospects, learning, listening, talking about how we can derive mutual value from both of the things that we do, irrespective of any particular vertical or type of company. And obviously a lot about data security and how we're going to reliably and responsibly respond to today's cyber threats.
Great. Thank you. And to that end, just a reminder, Scott mentioned this, but there is a Q&A section that you can use. So as you're learning and listening from Jason and Tom, you can also ask questions and bring it into the fold. And we'll be monitoring that along the way and then have time at the end for some of that as well. So where I'd love to start the discussion is really at a more foundational level as we go into all things unstructured data. What does unstructured data include? Because sometimes folks come from a certain industry, they have a certain idea of what that means. Let's just start there. How do you define unstructured data and perhaps covering it from the different industries you guys have worked with?
So I'll go ahead and start. Oh, go ahead, Tom. You go.
No, I insist. You got it.
All right. So I worked for a long time, Natasha, in healthcare. And so that really tempers my perspective on a great example of unstructured or even semi-structured content. When you think about patient imaging, and you think about all the amounts of material about patients that a care provider would collect. So I think when I kind of think of an example in my mind, that's where I go. Some industries are obviously more heavily regulated than others. So I think there's a question in terms of what the overall sensitivity of one industry's unstructured data versus another. But just from a broad definition perspective to your question, it really is any file repository which has no structure. I think, for all intents and purposes, that's what it boils down to. So when you think about a file share, put simply, if you think about a folder on your computer's hard drive, those are unstructured content sources, meaning they don't map to a row or table. They don't live inside of a database, which is a very structured kind of data model. That's essentially what they are. And I think the other thing that characterizes them too is that they tend to grow and scale much more rapidly than structured data does, largely because they're so easy to add to. Think about it on a personal level. We all take pictures of things. We store those pictures of things because now picture taking is a digital exercise. So with that having been said, it's so easy to add 20 photos to your photo library, and your photo library effectively is an unstructured data repository. You could argue it's semi-structured because you have metadata tags and you might be able to make albums and try to classify it a little bit more, but it just kind of plops into a folder more or less. That's how I would say, that's unstructured.
Yeah, that's great. There's two things that you said there that I think are important. One, like if we were to break it down to the most simple of terms, if you can plop it into a folder, that could be your barometer. And then the second piece is I always love starting with these micro or more consumer-like examples. And I think the photo option is a good one. And also the healthcare examples, right? Imaging files, other artifacts that any kind of clinician or research facility might be capturing about a person. Tom, do you have something to add to that as well to help set the stage?
Kind of from a more general perspective, unstructured data can be either textual or non-textual. It could be human-generated, things like text files and documents, video and audio files, emails. And it can also be machine-generated. Log files, sensor data from IoT devices, which have become really popular as of late. Just think of all the devices that you own and how much data they're collecting. And that's all unstructured data. And in fact, the vast majority of new data that's being generated today is unstructured. I think Gartner's latest estimate is about 80 to 90% of all enterprise data is unstructured data. And that's prompted this whole emergence of new platforms and tools that are able to manage and analyze it, and why we're here today. If you look at some of the specific examples, Jason talked about healthcare. Life sciences has a lot of imaging, genome sequencing, researching, M&E, media and entertainment. Some of the things that were really strong drivers in network attached storage when I first started. Things for like post-production, animation, special effects. You look at government systems, CAD.
We lost Tom for a moment there. He'll come back. And so, Jason, while we wait for Tom to come back, one of the things that, we could have a variety of different listeners here, and helping them make this connection to where they might have unstructured data within their organization. And I think there's a couple different questions I have for you on this front, which is, how have you seen this evolve over time with the different, let's start with the different tools. Tom was starting to talk about different platforms where unstructured data could be coming from. Like if we just focused on that, let's have a little chat about where we've seen the evolution and maybe where it's gotten more. I think my assumption is it's gotten more complex, but I'd love for you to comment on that.
I agree with you emphatically about that last point. And ultimately more risk prone, I think, because I think, like, to kind of foreshadow into data security and cyber risk, because I think that's the context of where we're going with unstructured data. It grows so much, and it is all tied to identity, and it's very difficult to classify because it is growing so much, and because there are so many different repositories depending on the source data that's writing this unstructured data, that it's very difficult to get a handle on. And if you look at today's cyber threats, what you find is that more and more and more and more, I'll use Caesars, MGM as recent examples because they're public, is those are exfiltration events, which are all about attacking unstructured data repositories. But to your specific question, to kind of go back in time, I see two sort of parallel paths. And then they eventually converged, and one was symbiotic with the other. One is, if you look at the rise of shared computing away from sort of siloed computing, where in the days before client server, there was no construct of something that you could share amongst a variety of different end users. Everything was contained locally. So as applications began to understand shared repositories, and then that's sort of like path one. Path two is there was a industry, the storage industry, the data storage industry, that emerged as a function of applications being able to understand and write to shared mediums. So I think there's always kind of these parallels. One comes before the other, which is the application started to write more and more data, and the per file size started to increase, which means that these early shared repositories needed to get larger. And also they needed to be able to scale and expand quickly, because it was fairly unpredictable how much more a year over year a given company, irrespective of their vertical, was going to need. The other thing is maybe there's a third stream, which is the digitization of of business processes and procedures. So for example, if you look at healthcare, patient imaging at one time is paper records. Perhaps there's, X-ray film, right? It's film-based. Then they start, all these PACS and patient imaging systems start to be able to write digitally directly. So now they need a file repository in order to write to, So I think then there's applications which traditionally were not digitized who become digitized, and then they start exploding the growth. Tom spent a good amount of time at EMC, so did I. And one of the most popular products were scale out network attached storage platforms. So if I think of unstructured in an enterprise today, that's the first sort of repository or, source that I'm going to, is because any company, irrespective of vertical, has a lot of that. And there are applications which rely solely on that. So I think if you look at the history, that's what you see. You see a digitization wave where applications needed to be transitioned from physical mediums to digital ones, and they needed places to store that data. You see the rise of an industry that was designing products to support that, particularly the scalability and the growth. And then you see the movement from siloed or non-distributed computing models to shared services or shared computing models. And I think when you combine all those things together, you get where we are. And then I think the overall thing, Natasha, too, is that as a whole society, the digitization of life has exploded. I mean, exponentially. I mean, people now, if you think about it, live their entire existences, especially young people, because I have 3 teenagers, so I am an expert on this fact, through digital mediums. They live through social media, which is really the posting and sharing of files, if you think about it.
Yeah.
So I think there's just this profound explosion in that regard, and that only seems to be continuing, whether if you look at it in a business or a, culture or personal or people context, it's all going digital.
Yeah, I love that. And welcome back, Tom. I think, Jason, that was super well said. And thank you for that. Where the other piece of this that I want to talk a little bit more about is, again, super well said, right? And I see all the tendrils. This is what's almost overwhelming me. There's almost no words to say, oh my gosh, we can't even encapsulate it. But I think you did a great job of explaining that. The other piece I want to talk a little bit more about, because we've talked about not just the data sprawl, but the application sprawl, I think your comments about the digitization and the perpetual, everything is now requiring more of all of those things. The other piece, so again, we're going to have a variety of different types of listeners here on the call. Ultimately, this is the sole responsibility for storing, protecting, and being able to recover this data should something happen falls on the shoulders of a small group of people. And then there could be multiple owners within a given organization touching all of this different unstructured data. And so maybe I start with Tom. What have you seen change with the different folks who are involved in unstructured data, whether it be that small group that's responsible for storing it, or the folks who have an opportunity to maybe do some storage or management of it?
So as far as the individuals involved, that has gone so broad, right? Back in the early days when you were dealing with direct attached storage, you had a direct server and storage relationship, and it was typically one administrator managing it. And then with network attached storage, you have the network sprawl, a lot more people with their hands on it. The inventive iSCSI cloud storage. There's so many different avenues to store data and so many different types to store it on, and they're typically in different individual silos with individual administrators. So you've got a lot more exposure to the risk of cyber threats because of that being so broadly spread.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so lots of different teams. And Jason, what have you seen on the backup and recovery side in terms of central ownership, and then working with all of these different workflow teams that are creating unstructured data and apps that then the unstructured load?
Several things. One is, I think the general, if you will, go-to-market or operational procedure around backup and recovery, irrespective of the data source, but if we want to use unstructured as kind of our foundation or our example there, I think for the most part remains unchanged. But where I see the complications starting to arise is there's so many ways to attach or provision unstructured storage, particularly when you start to talk about public cloud, right? One of the wonderful benefits of public cloud is its elasticity and its simplicity, I think. But the challenge then becomes if that which is unknown also becomes that which does not get protected. So that's where I see a lot of the struggle, if you will, is how do we consolidate all of these different places where we might otherwise store data in unstructured repositories into a single protection fabric. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where people are in a rush to get a handle on that. So that way they can consolidate how they would do backup and recovery into a single location. That's number one. But then also, two, that they can ensure and attest to auditors or regulators that they protect and therefore can recover data in the exact same way, irrespective of its source location or the kind of data that it is. And that's much easier said than done, particularly in large enterprises where there's so many things going on. And to Tom's point and to yours, there's application owners who may have cross-functional capabilities or responsibilities to provision their own resources. Mm-hmm. And I think that's when it starts to get a little bit blurry.
Yeah,
and so that's what I see a lot.
So that self-service makes it a whole lot easier, but like everything else, it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, right? It creates its own challenges. One thing that I would add to your comment about cloud storage is one of the things that I've seen is the perception that you magically take care of things that are moved into the cloud. There was a major financial institution about 6 months ago that we were working with that started backing up to the cloud or putting their data in the cloud, but believed that we were backing their data up, that they no longer had to back up data. I mean, it's a shared responsibility model. We take care of the infrastructure that the data resides on, but you still have to have backup, disaster recovery processes in place.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
100%.
100%. So yeah, and this is a great segue into, some of these challenges that folks have to consider. One, I would say this is an obvious one, but I do think that sometimes the obvious is important to articulate, is that if you're storing wherever it is, it needs to be backed up, right? And you need to be checking what those shared responsibility model rules are. There's, I think also, we've talked a lot about this and we're kind of dancing around it, but there's just a lot here, right? How do you get control over that sprawl and knowing the unknown? So I'll pause there and I'll just sort of keep it open there. One of those challenges, how do you get a grip?
I think it's data management, right? For a long time in the tech world, something like data sprawl, i.e. having more data than you know what to do with, and so much that you don't even know where it resides, was oftentimes seen as a good thing. How could it be a bad thing to have too much of a strategic asset, right? Data's important. But I mean, times have changed, right? The cybersecurity, data management, scaling implications of data sprawl are now all, too widely damaging to see it as a good thing. So to try and pull the reins in on data sprawl, I've seen customers putting policies in place that determine how data should be collected, why the data is collected, where the data should be stored, how long it should be retained, and then trying to ensure that all employees adhere to these policies. Now, this is obviously a much easier task if all data is stored in one repository where it can be searched and sorted via some centralized dashboard. But organizations need to know what data they have, who needs access to it, how much of it is archived, where it's stored, and what the business value is to the organization. They need visibility. I always say that you can't manage what you can't measure. So you need to start tracking several fundamentals about data, things like, how much data you're storing, the growth rate of that data over time. How many copies do you have? Is there a lot of data that's out there that's duplicate? Is there what we call ROT, redundant, obsolete, and trivial data? Who's accessing the data? Going back again to the number of workflow owners that have access to key intellectual property or the institutional crown jewels needs to be tracked. What are those access patterns? Things like, last access time. How many data sources do you have out there that hasn't been accessed in the last 5 years? Why are you keeping them? Where do they reside? File type sizes, owners, cost is another big one that's coming into play, right? Everybody's pulling the purse strings in, making sure that you understand what the associated cost is of that. So there's several data points that are important.
Yeah, I think those are some great points. Jason, I have a specific question for you from what Tom just mentioned, but do you have something to add?
Just quickly, you know how we always say, or I've heard often said, people, process, and technology. Well, I think it's probably pretty easy for Tom and I, because we come from manufacturers, to talk about the technology part. So I try harder to figure out or to think about the people part, because I think it's not my natural instinct, but I think it's so important. And where I'm going is traveling around and listening to a lot of chief information officers and chief information security officers and different people in IT, business leaders who are not technical, et cetera. What I hear a lot about is their struggle to communicate internally and build cross-functional coalitions who all care about or are directionally focused on the same thing, And I think when it comes to what Tom was talking about, these data management, these data classification aspects, those are so critically important, just in like general IT operations. But I also think when you talk about cybersecurity, especially if we all agree that exfiltration is sort of the attack vector du jour, then having a sense of where your greatest risk is and where your, say, sensitive data may be, I think is so germane to helping address that particular issue. But it takes a cross-functional alliance of different groups. And I just see this time and time again. Infrastructure doesn't regularly have a dialogue with IT security in so many companies. IT security doesn't have a regular dialogue with GRC and general counsel. All these groups are so important that they really need to be communicating and working together. IT infrastructure can't really understand the why behind anything if they don't understand the regulatory, the privacy, the compliancy bodies that rule and govern their particular business. Those are the reasons why they do backups. These are the reasons why they retain data for so long. There are legal implications, which is why it's great to have a relationship with your general counsel. So like that, to me, like that people aspect, on top of what Tom said, or in addition to what Tom said, I think is so important, because the most mature organizations I've ever heard of, read about, or talked to are ones that have a really strong sense of working together to address their data management, data classifications, and data security concerns.
Yeah, it's perfect, Jason, because this is exactly what I was going to have you comment on, which is, and it goes back to a couple things that you've said. One, the unknown is the unprotected. And, part of the pitch, part of the business value that Tom was just talking about is you have to be able to explain to teams, if I don't know what you're doing, if we don't have this single unified fabric to be able to understand where we're at, to better prepare ourselves with, like, if you want sort of an analogy, like that armor and that strength before something happens, where there's a incident or a breach, we've got to know what it is, right? And the second is, you had alluded earlier to some of the more public examples that have happened recently. Those were directly vectors of attack were directly with unstructured data. And I think we need to talk 100%. A little bit about how this particular challenge of how cyber criminals are evolving what they're doing. I mean, it's their business model, like that evolution, and the evolution with the blow up of unstructured data. Like, how are you seeing those two things? This could be something that could be helpful for our listeners to be able to understand, well, how could I help set up that the case for part of this business value of unified fabric is knowing, and is that risk averse piece, and better helping them understand what is happening out in the market.
Yeah.
So why don't you take that one
I
first?
think I think one big thing to me is, to the greatest extent possible, trying to aggregate your pools of analytics. Because if you're going to create insights off of that data, well, having all of the data in the same location, I think, becomes profound. And that, I mean, I'm biased on this next comment, obviously, but I think backup and recovery, using backup and recovery as a threat feed, as well as a place to do security analytics, we believe is a very novel idea. Why? Because it's a copy of all your data. Everything can be correlated to a common repository. So therefore, anything that would be deemed sensitive or at risk is all in one place to be analyzed. Not to mention, it's out of band and it's offline. So there's no agents that are required or things that need to go into production systems in order to get security analytics off them, or whole file serving systems that need to be scanned and crawled regularly to get results. You can do it on something that, if it isn't working to take backups, for example, is really just sitting idle, either waiting for a recovery or wide open to do these scans. And I think that's really profound, because to really get at the root of data classification, for example, where is everything and what its risk posture is, I think you have to have it in a common repository. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is again, go ahead.
I was going to say, just to state again the obvious under what you're saying, one of these evolutions of how the threat actors are behaving is they plug themselves in, hiding, watching, and then they know when you're going to make a move, right? And you need to be able to prevent that. And this is also something, some of these nuances that you've just outlined, I think that's an important piece for folks to have top of mind. Yeah.
100%. I think the other thing too is the dwell times are coming down significantly. According to Mandiant, in North America, they're roughly 5 days. Worldwide, they're roughly 9 days. And I think that's a big leap forward, even from 24 months ago, where you would see 30, 40, even as many as 100 days, where threat actors were spending a lot more time getting in and really reconnoitering on the environment and looking for opportunities to launch either a payload or strike or what have you. And I also saw then much more file level encryption events, which obviously would target unstructured. So the nature of the attack was to really cripple you and then to try to go after the backup so that you couldn't restore and thus pay the ransom if you want to get the data back. Nowadays, they found a way to shortcut that. I mean, let's face it, if you're getting to criminality, it's not, the less hard you can work, probably the better, right? Is your general point of view. So if I can get your sensitive data, that which I know you don't want leaked on the dark web, inside of a few short days, largely because somebody made a mistake and accidentally copied some kind of sensitive information to an unstructured repository, which was not controlled or secured in the way that it should have been, well, you can get to your results so much faster. So that's a big thing, Natasha, I'm seeing in just kind of the threat landscape is it's moving farther and farther away from file level encryption, which we all kind of, when we think of ransomware, at least historically, that's what we thought of, to much more really high speed, low drag data exfiltration. And if you look at the attacks, the payloads of the exfiltrations are small comparatively. I mean, I remember hearing of encryption events that are in the hundreds of terabytes or something, whereas exfiltration, a couple 100 gigabyte. I mean, how much really is a spreadsheet that has a bunch of personally identifiable information in it? I mean, it could be a 20 meg Excel sheet, and that's good enough, And so I think that's the other thing that is begetting this focus on unstructured data, because it is really the source or the repository for the most security risk today.
And on the other side of that, I mean, obviously there's the threat vector challenge to it, but to double down on your point about the value of that data, that's one of the shifts that I've seen over time. Some unstructured data started, using internal tags and markings to separate and differentiate various data elements, placing pairings and hierarchies. So they made them semi-structured, things like email, for example. The metadata in email enables analytics tools to classify and easily search for keywords, sensor data, social media data, XML type stuff, NoSQL database. They're all examples of unstructured data that evolve for greater searchability and are considered this semi-structured data. But for the most part, I think unstructured data is often locked away in siloed document management systems, individual devices, creating what's known as dark data, and which is unavailable for analysis. But things have changed, right? With the development of big data platforms, things like Hadoop, NoSQL, Amazon's simple storage service S3, as it's known. I mean, these platforms have really made it so where you've got the required infrastructure for processing and storing and managing large volumes of unstructured data without the need for a common data model or a single database schema. I remember back in the 90s talking about being able to eventually leverage data for competitive advantage. And now here we are 25 years later, and we're finally seeing it happen at a broad scale. So with the emergence of AI, organizations of all types and sizes can now transform that dark data into a real strategic asset. So it's not just a threat, but it's something that can be leveraged for a competitive advantage within the organization.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, there's a couple things. I'm going to keep going with this, like helping our listeners create a business case for this, because I think that we've brought up a couple of really important things. One, this idea that having everything in one central repository. Two, backups are, as Cookie said, we're biased towards it, but we think backups are the best of those options. The other piece, and Tom, you had talked a little bit about this earlier, and I'd love for you to comment on this, is to be thinking about the cost piece, and also how you have to think about scale when you are approaching sensitive data management and cyber-proofing it. Can you talk a little bit about that and considerations folks should think about?
In terms of cost and scale?
Yeah, let's talk about cost, and then and some of the things that you should be thinking about with the value that you want to consider as you're pulling everything together, right? So like when I think about AWS, I think about the global nature of being able to have different availability zones, that you have tiering options. There's other components to this, like it's not just one. There's not just one single stuff on the ground, right? There's some. There's training available, there's experts available, and there's technology available to help you think about putting these things into a repository that fits your business needs and business budget.
Okay, yeah, I spent years doing storage assessments, and going out with customers, and back in the days when I worked for Auspex, I sold network attached storage. So everything had to be a network attached storage solution. And then when you sold SANs, everything had to be a SAN or iSCSI, when in fact, it's really a fit for function conversation. You need to sit down and look at every application and what are the demands on that application? What are the performance requirements? What the availability requirements? And based on that, you're really going to architect a solution that fits that data model for that particular application. And then things can change, right? Over time, the value of that data, typically when it's created, it's valuable for 2 weeks. And then after that, not so much. And, after maybe 3 months, you may never access it again. So being able to have tiers of storage where you can say, if I need to access that data, it's immediately available off of SSD with something a little bit slower. Maybe I have it on a slower tier of storage, and then eventually I archive that off, where your costs over time for that storage is going to be getting drastically cheaper. So S3, for example, we've got 7 different tiers of storage that you can tier the data to based on, again, your performance requirements and the value of the data to the business. And you want to try to map that back. And then if you don't want to do the exercise of, mapping it back to each individual application, we actually have something called intelligent tiering that can do that for you. So it'll look at the access patterns. If it hasn't been accessed in over a month, it drops it down a tier, which automatically decreases your price over time.
Got it.
And I think heading on just real quick on the storage costs in general, this used to be a big driver when I was doing assessments. Customers would say, my storage spend is dropping 20% annually, so I should just buy more storage. For the average customer, their growth is vastly way greater than 20%, right? So you have a net increase in your storage spend. I think the average customer right now is spending 30% of their IT budget on storage. So being able to understand where you can save money and reduce the cost of the tiers is very important.
Yeah, and what I like about what you just said, and this is slightly different angles. It doesn't matter where you're looking in the organization as you're embarking on this. You want to be able to really understand where things are, right? So that can be you as a CIO or CISO doing that inventory, getting more of an idea of the known, turning the unknown into the known, right? And then being able to have that conversation with others. Again, I think you both have given some really great intro to get those folks in, maybe sharing this webinar with them afterwards from your organization to help them understand what that value would be. And then knowing that you have options once you have that information about how you put that together. Something that you just mentioned that also we were talking about, we just barely alluded to it. I can't leave our fireside chat without talking about it. I'd like you to cover is the sensitive data that could be lurking in the unstructured sprawl, whether it be the apps, the app generated, human machine, all of the things we've talked about, and the business case alone for sensitive data and where it falls, it has a special place even within how you're talking about being able to store it, recover it. What is the most important one or two things that you would offer for folks thinking about sensitive data in particular?
For me, organizations sometimes need to delete data altogether for legal reasons, right? For instance, ex-employee data, ex-customer financial data. So the ability to easily search for customer and individual names connected to files delivers a huge advantage, right? Granular search capabilities by either file extension or metadata. It lets the user locate intellectual property or financial data that might have been copied or moved to a location with appropriate security protections or access rules were applied. That all needs to be factored in to any security management or data management plan that you've got.
Great. Jason, how about you?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Tom said. I think the other thing is again, I'm just such a strong proponent of this people factor. I think, if I'm an IT practitioner at a given company, and I'm really struggling to understand what ultimately the sort of classification or the sort of why behind the types of data that we have, whether they be application systems or unstructured repositories or whatever, having some element of a relationship, say with GRC, with general counsel, and I guess, less so the practitioners and perhaps more the leadership, but just generally that door be open, I think is a big thing, because if they can understand it from a compliancy, privacy, regulatory perspective, and then teach or train the IT teams where that source is from, that it helps shape how the IT teams would provide services that not only adhere to those particular governance or regulatory bodies, but also that they could defensively explain why things are kept the way that they are, that they could attest that that's actually occurring inside of their systems, and they could build systems around that. I just find so many times things are done in a vacuum on individual teams because it's just easier, or maybe there's a perception about one team or another, so then that communication doesn't happen. But again, in the organizations where the lines of communication and the cross-functional work that gets done together is so commonplace, I feel like you tend to see more of it done the right way, rather than, that there be struggles. So I think that's a big thing, because I love what Tom said. That's so true. Like, you want to reduce your risk posture, start getting rid of things that you don't use. I mean, there's so many, like, to his point about assessments. I used to do those back in my EMC days, probably just like you, Tom. And remember, you would find this overwhelming amount of repositories of data that hadn't been touched in more than a year.
Or you found all 8 seasons of Breaking Bad on tier 1 stores.
That too. Talk about structured data. Yeah, 100%. Like, wow, we're really extending this privilege of computing to our end users, aren't we? But it's like, that to me is like in and of itself the crux of why communication is so important. Because I bet there's GRC and compliance teams who are like, what? We're keeping that? We're not supposed to do that. Like, what happened there? Isn't there a policy that trims that data off or whatever? So that's why, Natasha, to me, I think that's such a critical element, because us IT practitioners and technologists, we can shape the tools, no problem. But if we don't understand the why, well, we can't do that. And that's my take.
Yeah, I think this is a great, looking at we've been talking about the evolution of all of this. And I think one of the things that we're asking folks who are listening to think about that is different, besides, there's some of the practical things we talked about, right? Data explosion, apps, and hey, reach across the table, shake a few more hands, and really start to focus on listening to what other teams need. Where can you fill the gaps with education? And really, these types of nuggets are knowledge that we need to share across other teams, in the name of, we need to create an inventory. We need to create more of a plan we need to be able to all be on the same page for that, and then go from there. And I think that's a good segue into something I'd love for both of you to cover, which is, in theory, a lot of folks, this probably isn't their first introduction to thinking about all of this, or they may have been doing it a certain way for a long time. Are there certain things that you think have expired in their usefulness in cyberproofing unstructured data, such as, like, maybe we should talk about snap and replicate options, or anything else that you think folks should think, hey, if I'm doing this today, I should go reconsider another method?
One of the things that I've seen is, I think historically many organizations have considered backup and recovery as the last line of defense against ransomware attacks. However, the newer variants are targeting backup files, so it's no longer certain that the backup files haven't been encrypted or completely deleted. So in order to defend against these new attacks, multiple copies of backup should exist and should be stored securely. If you look at the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, CISA, they recommend adopting a 3-2-1 best practice approach when backing up data. So this approach really involves keeping 3 copies of data on 2 different media types, and one of those types being offsite, ideally in S3. So we recommend taking this approach even one step further, creating a 3-2-1-1 strategy by keeping at least 1 copy on immutable and indelible storage in S3, and preventing those objects from being deleted or overwritten for a fixed amount of time or indefinitely. So with S3 object lock capabilities, you can actually meet those regulatory requirements that require worm and or that extra layer protection against object changes and deletion. But traditional backup and recovery is not going to cover it.
Yeah, I think that's great. How about you, Jason?
Couldn't agree more. You took the words right out of my mouth. 3-2-1, multiple copies, and as many, the spreading of failure domains is the ticket. I mean, because you can't always assume that the place where you took the protection is the place where you're going to do the recovery. So I think that's another thing. And then having a very good handle on, by application or by service, what your anticipated or expected recovery workflow is to look like, how long you expect that to take or require that to take, and then at what point in time do you want to be able to roll back to. Because I don't know, like in IT security, Natasha, they talk a lot about, or say a lot of the time, defense in depth, right? That it's never any one thing. I think data protection is the exact same concept. You don't want to be too redundant because we don't have all the money in the world. So we do have to be budget conscious. But at the same time, I think it's snap and replicate plus backup and recovery. Like I don't subscribe to the idea that it's one or the other, because I think you're addressing a different kind of recovery workflow in each technology use case. You're also addressing a different type of failure scenario with backup and recovery. To Tom's point, I'm thinking about whole corruption, whole failure. I'm thinking about response to cyber incidents. That means you have to assume that the primary copy, as well as snapshot, tree, or fork, is corrupted or not available. And I think that's where the kind of thinking about what is the right tool for the right job begins, is as I kind of work those scenarios out, understanding my applications and my requirements. So I think a backup or data protection in-depth strategy is the right one. I have 2 or 3 days of online snapshots in primary storage and unstructured storage. I can roll back files or folders or volumes quickly, but I also have a 3-2-1 in my backup and recovery technologies, because now I can withstand all kinds of different failure scenarios, as well as I can transfer data to other physical locations, assuming that a different recovery center is where I would recover, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of my lens, is really having a approach which is consistent with the problem you're trying to solve in each case.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, I heard a couple things from you guys. One is check what's publicly available and, get yourself educated on the latest. And then the second, which goes back to one of the things we're suggesting, is reach across the table, shake some new hands, start to work with other folks in the organization, is opening your perspective to other ways that you can extend what you already have, and thinking about, I think just missed the quote, Jason, that you said is like right tool for the right job, right? Really looking at this inventory of not just the data, not just the teams, but also why are these tools here? And then again, we're coming back to Tom's seed that he planted, which is being able to make that strong business case. So knowing how you're going to put all those pieces together, all of this. And I think I'll also highlight, and the last thing I'll say, and then we'll open it up to questions that I'd love for you guys to comment on. This isn't done in necessarily one fell swoop, right? This is, first of all, we hope that everyone's doing it ongoing, but you can chunk this out, right? Yeah. So
it's a complicated challenge, right? And it's going to require a complicated solution, not necessarily, but there's a lot of aspects to it. It's not as simple as flipping a switch. That's the other thing that I think that people have a misconception about. I can buy this solution and flip this switch and everything's good. It takes continuous work and effort on multiple parts.
But get started, because the unknown is the unprotected. Exactly. And all, these other pieces we were talking about, you got to start somewhere. And I think you guys have given some really great recommendations for both the mindset to go into this, as well as tactical suggestions where folks can go get, started with, where am I today? Which teams do I need to start working with? Which apps do I need to start looking at? Where are the blind spots that I may have that I should go ask some questions? As we open it up again, if anyone wants to use the Q&A there, that's available. Any final parting thoughts that you want folks to leave with, Jason and Tom?
You mentioned something, Natasha, just as you were stating your closing there, is get started, or continue if you're already started. I liken it to something in my own personal life. So I play guitar, specifically jazz, and playing in jazz, they have a concept called changes, which is the chord progressions of various jazz tunes, usually standard tunes. There's a lot of chords and they move really fast, especially if you play up-tempo. So they talk about in jazz, like playing over changes. It's a very, very difficult art form. And, it's something that I practice, or I try to practice as much as I have for it. When I'm really on it, it's every day. When I'm not so on it and I'm traveling a lot, not as much. But I never give up. And it's just like, it just kind of strikes me as an analogy of something that, yes, I may never be the world's greatest or even a professional jazz guitar player, but each day, or when I can get to it, I try to tackle that issue. And I feel like anything like this, that yes, is complex, constantly changes, has a lot coming at us. The tendency is to kind of, you want to hide or not really deal with that. But I think the more you can spend time with it, little by little, you make incremental improvements. And those incremental improvements lead to thwarting a cyber event one day, or being able to respond to a cyber event, or not paying a ransom. I mean, you'd be surprised. Just those little incremental improvements each and every day mean a lot. So that really resonates me. Get started or continue if you've already started.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Jason. How about you, Tom?
Yeah, Jason, I love the analogy, that the jazz guitar. That's great. Wish I learned to play something other than the radio. But anyway, as far as just that point of starting, there are no perfect solutions out there. And this is a continually evolving problem. I think what you need to do is look at, how can I minimize my exposure and continue to do this? It's going to be an ongoing process, right? I think we've got a pretty strong combined solution today to help customers with that. And it will obviously continue to evolve as threats evolve.
I totally agree.
I think one of the things that I would recommend for customers that are really trying to look at, where do I start with this? If you are looking at, implementing some type of multi-layered comprehensive strategy, the National Institute of Standards and Technology has a 5-pillar model for, identifying, protecting, detecting, responding, and recovering to a ransomware event. It's a really good site to go check out. Just understand ransomware in general, what they recommend as far as, providing protection for yourself and putting yourself in the best position in the event that something does happen.
1,000%. I think NIST has done a really great job of making it consumable. So fantastic. Well, We have a few minutes for questions, and Scott, I think you have been manning the chat. What do we have on tap here?
Yeah, we do have some questions here, and just, personally, in order to participate now in this Q&A portion, I feel like I need to bring some cheese to the fireside cheese party. So imagine I'm arriving with some Gouda and some Munster. But let's see. We've got a question from Chris. This touches on something that Tom mentioned. Chris is asking, how do you see AI impacting storage? So maybe I'll turn that to Tom first. Just anything else you want to add about that?
So I mean, just the demand for AI, like I said, the potential for you to actually take advantage of this data that's been sitting at rest for decades, that people have been promising that you're going to be able to leverage for a competitive advantage. Artificial intelligence actually enables you to do that. And I think once that breaks loose, all these things that, we're collecting data on from IoT devices and everything else is just going to explode. I see storage growth even growing faster than it is now as a result of AI because of the information that you can pull from that data. It's no longer just sitting there. It's a valuable asset.
Okay. And Jason, did you want to add anything on AI and storage?
Yeah, I think, holistically, not just in storage, but in everything, there's such a rush to figure out how to leverage AI. What I think from a storage perspective, particularly is, over time, I anticipate technologies and just AI being leveraged to train models to understand user access behavior, really trying to get a keen sense of who has access to what, how frequently do they access it, has that changed over time, and how quickly? Because if you look at it through a lens of cybersecurity, this type of user access analysis, I think, becomes really, really important to try to understand a pattern of behavior, which either is normal or abnormal. And I think that's one of the cool things that AI brings is the ability to train models to try to understand behavior. And hopefully, in the case of cybersecurity, to prevent something bad happening before it does.
Next question here. Bradford is wondering if Rubrik has or recommends a tool for discovering unknown, unstructured data in our environment. So Jason, that one's for you, I think.
Yeah. So a couple of things. One is obviously the Rubrik portfolio itself has a capability called sensitive data discovery. So the workflow, Bradford, would be we would take a backup of your data, and then we would put sensitive data discovery analyzers on top of that. And within a few minutes, we would have back information classified by various regulatory, compliance, and privacy and governance bodies that are built into the solution. We have over 60 different analyzers that map to those compliance bodies. And then we have the ability for you to create your own custom one. So that would be one vector. The other one is there's a technology we recently acquired called Laminar, which sits in the data security posture management space. And their intent is to scan data that lives outside of, say, a backup, perhaps to scan it at the place where it lives, and in particular, the public cloud and SaaS applications like Salesforce, Workday, et cetera. It also can look at structured data, so actually crawl into databases and understand is there sensitive material, PII, et cetera, inside of certain rows and tables, so that you've got a handle on it from that direction. And then more generically, there are a variety of different tool sets. I mean, Tom and I cut our teeth on running unstructured and file server assessments. There are scanners and analyzers that you can find out on the web, as well as there are free, paid for utilities that you can leverage that will crawl a particular file share or file store, and then they will give you a report. And some of them will even break down some user analytics aspects like frequency of access, some graph of, how big your file sizes are and what their distribution is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those three things would be what I would recommend.
Okay, excellent.
All great tools.
And then Bill has a question that's pretty on point. When dealing with petabytes of NAS data, scalability becomes crucial. Can you share insights into how Rubrik and AWS ensure seamless scalability, especially in hybrid on-premises and cloud environments?
So I'll take that one from the beginning, and then Tom, I'll pass it to you. So a couple of things. We're designed to work hand in hand architecturally from the ground up. And we leverage AWS storage repositories as a place to send and secure the backups that we take. Not to mention protecting data that lives within AWS, whether they be virtual instances running in EC2, unstructured repositories in S3, or perhaps file services riding on top of AWS services provided by various storage vendors. So kind of A to Z as it relates to that. The other thing is it relates to scalability. So the technologies we have were designed using modern tools and techniques, thinking about internet's file system scale. So they are all scale out. They are based on a variety of, like I said, modern development techniques that are able to scan, fetch, and walk metadata very, very quickly, which means they can ingest a rapid amount of data with a pretty efficient or a low amount of compute in order to do that. And then, of course, as they move the data to other repositories, like things in AWS, they can also do that very quickly. In addition, as they're doing that at scale, it can also rationalize data, so dedupe and compress it. So that helps with, the time it would take, as well as the implied costs of getting the data up to those locations. So if you look at kind of from an architectural perspective, it was really designed for internet scalability from the ground up. Tom, I'll turn it to you.
I'd say for over 17 years, AWS has been delivering cloud services to millions of customers around the world, running a variety of use cases. We've got the most operational experience at greater scale of any cloud provider out there. Internally, we say that there's no compression algorithm for experience, and that's because you can't learn certain lessons until you get different milestones in scale, and we've achieved many of those milestones beyond any other cloud provider.
All right, tremendous. Well, it looks like we're running out of time here, unfortunately. But Natasha, if somebody wants to get started with Rubrik and AWS or find out more, what do you recommend?
I recommend visiting Rubrik.com. We also have these handouts that we've included here are a great start. Those would be the two spots. And there you can also find all sorts of information about our partnership with AWS. We're also listed on the AWS Marketplace. So that would be a third place that I would go check everything out.
Okay, excellent. Well, Natasha, Tom, Jason, thank you guys so much for just a fantastic conversation. Really, really enlightening.
And thanks
for having us, Scott.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Right. Have a great day, everyone.
Take care.
Okay, and before we wrap up, we do have one more piece of business. It's the Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of that $250 Amazon gift card today is Dennis Nisney-Dahl from Kentucky. So congratulations to Dennis. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Rubrik and AWS for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That concludes today's event. Have a fantastic rest of your day. And we hope to see you next time.